everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. We're on the homeward straight to Christmas, so hope you enjoyed our little specially Christmassy welcoming video there from Hannah. Thanks so much, Hannah, for doing that. I'm delighted to welcome you to this breakfast briefing this morning entitled Working at Home, the Impact of Covid-19, and delighted to be joined by Professor Jonathan Morris from the Business School and Professor Alan Felstead from the School of Social Sciences. So my name's Sarah Lethbridge. I'm the Director of Executive Education and External Relations at the Business School. If you've got any short course queries, get in touch. So speech to text captioning is available for this event. Somebody in the background is going to kindly post the link, so you can click on that and follow a live stream of everyone's discussion. So hopefully that makes the session more accessible for everybody. When you click that link, it'll open up a new window, and then I think the trick is to manipulate the different windows, Zoom and the speech to text captioning, and then hopefully you'll be able to see all of our brilliant presenters and the speech running alongside as they discuss everything. So bit of a flag for our next breakfast briefing in the new year. That's going to be delivered by Dr. Hussein Jahansal Shahlu, and it's going to be about Bitcoin under the microscope. So if you're like me and you hear a lot about Bitcoin, but you're not entirely sure what it's about and how it could help your business, then please do tune in Tuesday the 26th of January at 8:30 and you'll hear all about that. So it's an exciting start to our 2021 breakfast briefing calendar. If you do have any suggestions, then please do drop John Parry Jones a line, because we're always interested to hear from our community about the sort of events that they're interested in. Open bespoke programs. We're still accepting places for our Masters of Public Leadership program. That's the program director's Dr. Catherine Farrell. So if you're interested in that program, then please do get in touch with us or with Catherine Farrell, and she'd be happy to tell you more about what a wonderful program that is. We're also accepting places on our Leadership and Business Administration programme. So lots of the same deliverers on our executive programmes are part of that LBA. So we're really putting it out there as a kind of tiny mini taster MBA. So if you're thinking about an MBA, but potentially you haven't got the time or the energy, then the LBA might be a great option for you. So again, get in touch if that's something that you're interested in. We're going to try a networking session again after this breakfast briefing, because it's something that we really miss. We really miss chatting to everybody at our breakfast briefing sessions. So John Parry Jones is going to be lurking in a Zoom meeting, not webinar. I'm happy to talk to you, and we're going to post the link in the chat. So if you did want to say hello and wish us well on our Christmas holidays, then please do join us for that Zoom meeting chat. Look out for that as the session progresses. This webinar is going to be recorded, and if please, we really need your questions, so please post those in the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen if you want to ask anything of Alan and Jonathan. What else have we got? Oh, and just to say that this is an exciting adventure that we're doing in partnership with the Propel Hub, which is a cross-UK partnership exploring how high-quality, inclusive and engaging workplace practices can drive productivity and performance. So Cardiff's one of the partner members. We're also partnering with Aston, Ulster University, Universities of Strathclyde, East Anglia, Nottingham, Sheffield, and the CIPD. So there's lots of great people involved, and the job of the hub is to disseminate the latest research evidence and support business. So find out more about the Propel Hub. Alan and Jonathan are both part of the hub, so it's delighted, great that you're sharing some of that research and that we're joining together with the Propel Hub as part of this breakfast briefing event. So I think that's it for me. Watch out for an open evening that we're running at the beginning of January. We'll be sending you more information about that. So yeah, come and talk to us. I think it's starting at 5:30 at the beginning of January. We'll definitely be sending you more information about that, and we can talk to you about all the different programmes that we've got on offer at Cardiff Business School. So yeah, now please to hand over to Alan. I don't know if you want to get your slides up, Alan. And what we're going to be looking at today is two different perspectives of home working. So both Jonathan and Alan are really heavily involved in this research area. Alan takes more of a quantitative approach, so looking at the facts and figures related to home working, and Jonathan will be looking at more of a qualitative perspective. So it's really great that Cardiff University, we don't just like sticking in our silos, we don't like sticking to our schools, we like, really broadening and expanding our research across all the different disciplines in an interdisciplinary manner. So it's great that Jonathan and Alan are joined together to talk about this. Really, I'm heavily involved in home working at the moment, guys. It's driving me a bit insane, to be honest, but we're how many months in? 9 months in, and hopefully we'll get over to Alan now. Are you having problems there, Alan, sharing your screen?
Is that sharing?
That's sharing, brilliant. So I'll be quiet now, Alan, and hand over to you. Thanks so much.
That's sharing. So the first trick is to share your screen properly. So Bore da bawb, fy enw ydy Alan Felstead ac athro ymchwil ydw I. Hopefully you can see my screen. Is that correct, Sarah? Tell me if you can't.
Yes, I can, Alan.
Great. Good morning. My name is Alan Felstead, and I'm research professor in the School of Social Sciences at Cardiff University. I'm going to share with you some results of research that I've carried out over the summer with a colleague, Daria Ruska, at the University of Southampton. And I'm going to go through lots of facts and figures and lots of graphs. Apologies for that, but I've tried to make them understandable using bar charts and so forth. All of these slides will be available at the end of the session. John Parry-Jones is going to send them out probably tomorrow, I would have thought. So you'll better see them in all their glory later on. Now make sure that I can move my screen, which I don't seem to be able to. Is my screen moving? Yes, it is. Gosh. So first admission, or even a claim to fame, I've been studying home working long before it became fashionable. And boy, oh boy, has it become fashionable. My gosh. I mean, in fact, I got interested in home working a long time ago, in the mid-1990s, in fact, when I did a study for the Department of Education and Employment, DFE as it was then called, and the Department for Trade and Industry, DTI. Gosh, remember them? Today's equivalents, of course, are the Department of Education and the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. The results were published in a report called Home Workers in Britain on the left, and also in a book on the right. Back then, of course, the term home working referred to outworkers in the clothing industry, the boot and shoe workers, and assemblers and packers of various kinds, many of whom were low paid and sometimes off the books. Now, these types of examples have largely disappeared and have been replaced by the 21st century version of home working. And this refers to office workers, or what was called back then in the mid-1990s, new home workers or teleworkers. What I'm going to do in my 20 minutes is run through some data which paints a picture of the growth of home working since the UK was put into its first national lockdown in March 2020, and the consequences this might have for productivity. So the first question is, how has home working grown in recent times? This is before, during and after the lockdown. What's the survey evidence? Well, one of the longest running data series on the location of work is the Labour Force Survey. Now, this is a large survey which is regularly carried out. It contains data from around 45,000 workers. It paints a picture, as you can see in the graph here, of a long-term shift towards home working before the outbreak of COVID-19. But as you can see in this chart, the change was gradual rather than dramatic. So in the year immediately before the lockdown, 1 in 20 of us worked mainly at home. That was double the proportion in 2003 and actually triple the proportion in 1981. The April-June 2020 data suggest that the proportion working mainly at home rose rapidly in national lockdown to around 9% of workers, as you can see in that graph. However, this growth is paltry compared to other estimates, which focus on where people actually worked immediately before they were surveyed, and not on where they normally work, as in the case of the data reported in this graph. So one such survey is the COVID-19 study, and as its name suggests, it was carried out during the pandemic itself. And this suggests a similar but much more dramatic upward movement in home working. This study consists of a monthly survey of around 7,000 workers carried out during the lockdown and in the months since. Its results in this graph suggest that the proportion reporting that they worked exclusively at home rose eightfold, from 6% in January, February of this year to 43% in April. And even though it had fallen by the end of the lockdown in June 2020, it remained high throughout the lockdown months and has continued to do so. So I've added these kind of lines which suggest rapid growth and shallow decline since April 2020. It's important to say here that these two data sources, the labour force survey and the COVID-19 study, questions are not comparable, hence the different estimates. But the trajectory is clear, a significant rise in home working prompted by the UK national lockdown. Furthermore, the prevalence of home working has remained high in the months and weeks after the national lockdown ended. The data shown in this graph are taken from the Office for National Statistics survey of around 2,500 adults, which has been carried out every other week since March 2020. So this is real-time data I'm showing you here. This survey suggests that throughout the national lockdown, between 40 and 50% of workers were carrying out work at home. However, the proportion fell to around 1 in 4 workers in late August 2020. And so I've added the kind of arrow there to indicate that, as restrictions were lifted. Since then, of course, the proportion has risen again by 12 percentage points, as restrictions have been reintroduced, as we all know, and workers across the UK have once again been told to work at home if they can. Employer surveys also reveal a similar pattern. This figure shows the results of a recent survey of 5,500 employers in the UK, again carried out by ONS. Over a quarter were using home working as a direct consequence of COVID-19. That's the first bar, the first red bar. And just under a fifth of employers reported that they will continue to use home working after the pandemic has passed. That's the second red bar. The shift, of course, has led to changes in consumption patterns. Deodorant sales have fallen, and on this, the Daily Star and the Financial Times on the same day reported the same story in a slightly different take, as you'd expect from the Daily Star. They think it's all odour. The FT was a bit more restrained in its evaluation, talking about the changes in consumption patterns and its consequences for Unilever. Sales of bleach and jogging buttons have also risen as we clean our houses and swap our business ties, like I've got on now, and suits and skirts for jogging buttons. There is a new shortage, not of toilet rolls, but of jogging buttons. DIY sales have also risen too. So the consequences have percolated into consumption patterns. I'm now, if the technology allows, going to show you a video, a short TV advert, and the point, it was made 25 years ago and it was screened on British TV. It was produced by British Telecom and was intended to promote its products, some of which are now very dated. No mention of ISDN, remember that? But at the time, the advert was screened as a prompt to change the way we work, because BT wanted to sell more of its products to allow more people to work at home. And it asks the question, very pertinent today, why don't we change the way we work?
Why? Why do we use so much paper?
And the paperless office is quicker and more efficient.
Why do people go round and round in circles?
When communications technology could make the journeys unnecessary.
Why do people fly so far away? Just to talk about work?
When they could hold a video conference instead.
Why do they work in big buildings? So far from where they live?
When something as simple as email could allow them to work as effectively away from the office.
Why are the men on bikes in such a hurry?
When the packages they carry could often be sent in seconds by ISDN. BT are already bringing the communications technology revolution to 60,000 businesses every day. Why not change the way we work? Call BT on 0800 800 800.
So why not change the way we work? That was the question asked 25 years ago. Then the move to working at home was on a slow upward trajectory, as I've shown in the figures. Given the dramatic effect of COVID-19, we can certainly say that we have most definitely changed the way we work, with home working rocketing. But how has the character of home working changed? Who has it affected most? Well, the short answer is a lot, with the most privileged members of the labour market now working at home. Privileged in terms of the jobs they do, not the type of people they are. Now, let me explain that. So if we compare those who were working exclusively at home before the lockdown with those who are doing so during the lockdown months of April, May and June 2020, we find that the biggest rise in home working is amongst employees. Here I'm asking you to compare the blue and red bars and the rate of change. And amongst the highest qualified, here, those with degrees and above versus those with no qualifications. You can see the steep rise among degree holders and the rise among no qualification holders, but not as steep. So compare the blue bars with the red bars. Growth was also higher among the higher skilled those with higher skilled jobs, while it was far lower among the lesser skilled. Again, look at the size of the bars and the rate of change. Home working grew more quickly among more prosperous areas of the UK. So unfortunately in Wales, here in Wales, it was a strong growth, but not as steep as London and the South East, as shown in those charts. The higher paid too. Look at the rise in the average pay levels of those who work exclusively at home during lockdown. While those working outside of the home are consistently among the lower paid. The blue and red bars on the left barely changed. But the height of the bars differed little by personal demographic characteristics before and during the UK lockdown. Look here at across the blue and red bars. So the prevalence of working at home in lockdown did not vary by sex, ethnicity, or disability. Women weren't disproportionately affected. The men and those from ethnic minorities weren't disproportionately affected from those with the white community, and so on. What about the productivity consequences of the rise in home working? Well, can we get more done in our pajamas than in a suit? This is the left-hand side advert, working from home, Walter. Or are we more likely to slack? This is the right-hand side cartoon. Well, I'm an academic, so I often turn to theory, and our theory often gives conflicting answers, and it certainly does on this score too. So there are some reasons why we might expect productivity to go down when people work at home. Employees who work at home may not be able to learn from one another, given that a lot of learning takes place on the job, in sight and within earshot of others. Innovation may also suffer as employees become less engaged with work and their work colleagues. Effective team working may also become more difficult. But on the other side, home working may go up because employees working at home go the extra mile to prove that they are trustworthy. They can work without surveillance. Home working may shield employees from workplace disturbances and interruptions, and we're all interrupted in the office, I'm sure you'll agree. However, of course, domestic commitments may make home working difficult for some members of society, and productivity may fall. So what's the evidence? Well, here once again, I'm going to turn to the COVID-19 study and its June survey. Those who worked at home in the previous month were asked to compare how much they were able to do per hour compared to what they were able to do per hour before the pandemic. So this provides us with a then and now comparison. As you can see from this graph, on the whole, home working did not appear to affect productivity positively or negatively. It appears to have made little difference either way. Those who were working at home were also asked whether they would like to continue to work at home when social distancing restrictions are fully lifted. 9 out of 10 said that they would like to do so, and half wanted to work at home always or often. I'm drawing here from the pie chart on the top left. Furthermore, the most productive were the keenest to work at home in a post-COVID-19 world. Around 30% of those wanting to work exclusively at home in the future reported that they were able to get as much more done when they worked at home. This compares to around 5% of those who did not want to work at home in the future. See the left-hand side of the bottom figure and compare the red and blue columns. The right-hand side of that chart shows the reverse, with those not wanting to work at home reporting that their productivity had taken a major hit. Note the blue bar is bigger than the red. So going forward, letting those who want to work at home the ability to do so makes good business sense and may actually increase productivity in the future. Evidence from employer surveys also corroborates the finding that home working itself is having little effect on productivity. Most say that productivity did not change. That's the black column. This pattern is remarkably similar to the employer results I showed you earlier. A fifth of employers surveyed by ONS said that they intend to continue using enhanced levels of home working in the future. Increased productivity was the third most popular reason for doing so. That's the red bar in the top left-hand corner. However, reduced productivity was not a strong reason for not using home working in the future. That's the red bar in the bottom figure. The more likely cause was the inappropriateness of home working for the business. That is to say, some jobs simply cannot be done at home. Just think of it: lorry drivers, firefighters, paramedics, cleaners, the list goes on. This is shown in the black bar. It would appear then that increased levels of home working are here to stay. Hence the newspaper headlines on this slide, and I could have shown many. The shift, of course, has serious implications for the future nature of office space and its organisation. Maybe a future webinar, we should be looking at that. And the nature of the centre, given that many bars, restaurants and retailers are dependent on the spending power of office workers. Again, something to look at in the future. But we still don't know really how sustainable these patterns are. We are still in the midst of a pandemic. And luckily, however, the Covid-19 study will be revisiting the issue of productivity in the coming months. And I know full well that other researchers are also examining the sustainability issue through other means. So we will have evidence in the future to address. Andy Haldane, chair of the Industrial Strategy Commission, and of course, Chief Economist of the Bank of England, has recently voiced his concerns that productivity in the long term will be adversely affected as creative thought is made more difficult with remote working. It may be actually that different theories, the theories that I outlined earlier, may kick in at different points in this cycle. The short answer, we simply don't know. Why might that be? Well, face-to-face interaction, as we all know, has benefits. We learn from one another. Together, we build social bonds of friendship and collegiality. Innovation is often born out of collective face-to-face endeavours, and networks are best formed by face-to-face interactions and by chance meetings. The by chance meetings we can't do on this webinar, unfortunately, because I can't see all of you and we can't kind of interact in that way that we might otherwise in a face-to-face setting. So in summary, the dramatic growth in homework, in which you've all witnessed, and many on this call have experienced firsthand, followed a period of slow but gradual change. And I think we've moved from a situation of evolution in the world of work in terms of where we work. Evolution has now become revolution. The second point is that those with better jobs have experienced the most dramatic change of all. The third point is that productivity so far has not been adversely affected. And the fourth point is that home working may be in hybrid form, with people spending much more time at home than they did before the pandemic, is here to stay. So those who are interested in finding more detail, you'll have the slides at the end of this webinar, but also there's a report that you can look at. I've got the link there. Please download it. I look forward to hearing your comments and questions. Diolch yn fawr iawn am wrando arna fi, of course. Thank you very much for listening to me. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague, Jonathan Morris, who will be talking about the lived experience of working at
Shall I share
home
screen?
Not yet.
among managers. He too has been carrying out research on home working since the pandemic began back in March 2020, and he'll be giving more qualitative account of the lived experience, something behind the facts and figures that I've shared with you now. So I'm going to stop my screen.
Hello, everybody. Hope everybody can see me. Thank you very much, Alan. Very interesting. So, a qualitative account of the crisis and what working from home was like. A little like Alan, my study was a little bit perhaps opportunistic, given the nature of it. However, this kind of work reflects long-standing interests in work and particularly working from home. So a bit back to the future. About 20 years ago, in about 2000, I started a study of looking at how organizations were sort of re-engineering and what implications that had for managers in those organizations. And it was a comparative study between Japan, America, and Britain. So very much a qualitative study. We looked at 30 organizations across these countries and about 250 managers. So that is the background. I think the background's important. If you look at the yellow at the bottom, basically organizations were going through a process of re-engineering, and that had big and major implications for managers in those organizations. And managers were basically facing an increasing volume of work. And managers tried to cope with this by working in work, but also coping with longer hours of work by taking home work, working on PCs, laptops, etc. And just at the beginning of the research, we were in America in about 2003, 2004, was the emergence of the BlackBerry, which myself and my co-researcher had never heard of. Fast forward 10, 15 years. Our second study, we went back and looked at similar organizations, the same organizations in many respects, very, very similar managers to the ones we'd looked at before. And again, one aspect of this was looking at how managers cope with home working. And the big difference we found was whereas managers in the first study welcomed the flexibility that home working gave them, the big difference this time was the kind of ubiquity, if you like, and pervasiveness of sophisticated digital technology, and in particular, the smartphone. And what managers were complaining about was that they found it very difficult to escape work. They were always on call. Non-work divides were very, very blurred. And managers had become, whereas they were very positive about it in the first study, very cynical about it. But on the other hand, they just had to do this homework to cope with their work volumes. And indeed, the younger managers, well, again, very cynical and not very accepting, just sort of said, well, this is something we have to do. Okay, so the second study finished it was about 2016, 2019. Suddenly the coronavirus pandemic struck, and I thought, well, this would have major implications for home working, for managers. So very quickly, we did a quick and dirty research project. We went back to the organizations, back to the managers from the second study, sent them a questionnaire, then followed that up with a Zoom call. This was a kind of mixture of services and manufacturing, private, public, high-tech, low-tech, etc., and importantly, a mix of managers by their age and by their gender. We started off with a fairly simple questionnaire, looking at their demographics, gender and age and whatever, how long they anticipated working from home, what were the longer implications of work where work was carried out, and importantly for them personally, what were the advantages and disadvantages of working from home. Managers were partly chosen because they'd studied them before, but also, as Alan has just said, because they could work from home, whereas a lot of people couldn't. The managers, this is back in early June, didn't anticipate going back to work anytime soon. And as it subsequently turned out, probably underestimated when they would go back. And I think it was quite surprising that even in industries like, one of our case studies was the brewing industry, people were still working from home. So sort of industries where you might have expected, I know there were managers, but managers to be in work, they kind of weren't in work. And this is despite sort of efforts at the time, if you remember, by Boris Johnson and others to try and get people back to work, where he was almost talking to the civil service and saying, you need to get back. So very, very briefly, what are the advantages and the disadvantages? I'm sure everybody's sort of nodding their head. One of the big advantages is obviously the lack of commuting time, particularly for managers in London and the Southeast, but I think more generally. If you think sort of people in the Southeast have typically commuted for 2, 3, 4 hours a day for all of their lives, and I think there was somebody thinking, oh God, this is what an advantage this is. We don't have to do it. Kind of curiously kind of coming out of that, and also it's not only the commuting, a lot of people had to do traveling in work and they didn't have to do that anymore. I think that an element involved with that was sort of presenteeism, where people had to be seen to be at work and with their bosses. That had gone, and managers were very, very positive about that. I think following on from that, there were kind of associated advantages with work-life balance, in that people were spending a lot more time from home, but clearly for carers of small children, that wasn't the case. I think that there was some evidence, not many managers had previously worked from home full time, that they'd taken work home, but they hadn't worked from home full time. That those managers who had worked home full time found it much easier to adapt to home working. And I think that partly that is that they kind of got themselves in a sort of pattern and the structure. But also the kind of wider kind of organizational context was that people accepted they work from home and maybe accepted the barriers and the limits to that. What are the disadvantages? Curiously, the disadvantages, some of the disadvantages are quite like the advantages. Managers found their work, non-work divides increasingly blurred. They found that work could be at times incredibly isolating, with a sort of belated appreciation, I think, really of the sociability of office work. People find it very kind of difficult to turn off from work at home, whereas the actual physical thing of going in and coming home, that was the sort of the turn off, if you like. I think that they found work monotonous and very challenging, whereas at work you might go and get a cup of water or whatever. There's kind of a lack of downtime, and people found being almost sort of continuously on call and instantly their day extended. Finally, and we've kind of found this in previous business breakfasts, communications. I find that communications can be more difficult. Zoom can be kind of very, very physically tiring. I have a small group of people who work for me. I email them something and we have to go back and forth, whereas previously I used to just go upstairs and ask them to do something. That is kind of slightly more difficult. Unsurprisingly, another disadvantage is that people with small children found childcare and homeschooling extremely challenging. That people had to try and compensate for that by working around the clock, working weekends, a bit of a lack of division between working and parenting. We interviewed one female middle manager, and she told us it was either my kids or my job. So there were kind of huge pressures on timescales, particularly for single parents. Okay, schools went back. This is June, remember, schools went back, but the kids were still isolating, childcare was mixed, breakfast clubs had gone, etc., etc. So I think that there is evidence that parents of both genders were particularly hit, but particularly females were badly hit. And I think particularly in a context where females had decided to take a sort of a backseat in the first place, then this kind of compounded that in a way that they now definitely needed to take sort of back. Okay, the previous study's been looking at kind of organisational and managerial issues. This was kind of looking at more managerial issues. Looking at organisations, I think there clearly a lower cost base for companies, organisations. A number of organisations that we had have given up their leases on expensive city centre properties. I think there are major kind of control issues. The supposition that the question of are people shirking from home? I think organisations are going to have to get their heads around people working from home and big sort of trust issues. I think there are issues of communications, which I sort of touched on, my lack of communications with some of my people who work with me. And I think there are big kind of issues of organisational learning. How do individuals learn in a process where they're working from home? Very, very quick postscripts. That was the first study. That was in June. I went back a couple of weeks ago and went back to the organisation to see how things were going. The results were very, very much the same as the first study, although obviously the children were back at school, which is a big bonus for working parents. But I think if anything, the issue of isolation of home workers was heightened. People and the sociability of work was really kind of missed. Everybody was saying that. Everyone was saying, that there was kind of lack of structure of the working day, that it was relentless. Although again, the people who were used to home working, and there weren't many of those, found that less the case. In terms of going back to work, that had been put off. There was considerable speculation on what the future of work might be. Many of the managers I was talking to just could not imagine going back full time. But what I think one of the kind of big negatives of this was a number of the managers were sort of saying, well, how do we develop learning in our teams? It's very kind of difficult. A number of the managers have been assigned to new teams and they've not met physically those people in the teams. And there's kind of whole question of sociability. Sorry, this is a bit off piece, but we also, I've got a Japanese colleague who went and looked at this in Japanese organizations, and it's quite interesting because you think, well, the technology is the same in Japan as it is in Britain, but there were kind of quite significant legal, medical, and cultural differences. Cultural differences, people live in small houses and find home working much more difficult. So home working in Japan, despite having a slightly less bad pandemic, but the technology being the same, people were not working from home as much. And the final one, and this applied to the UK sample a bit as well, is that one of the implications of this is that if you're letting people work from home, then they can work from home outside your organization and work from home potentially from outside your country. So a big tech organization that had was increasingly subcontracting work to Eastern Europe and to India were turning around and saying, well, we don't need it in Britain. If we don't need people to come to the offices, we're going to outsource work abroad. But it's Christmas. Hey, let's. I've a fairly sort of bit of a pessimistic account in some ways. Let's end up with a slightly more optimistic account. So I think potentially there are very, very positive environmental issues, a lack of people commuting. I think secondly, there is the potential for leveling up and rejuvenating communities. If people don't actually have to be in work, then they can be somewhere else. And in terms of the South Wales valleys, that may give us potential for leveling up, rejuvenating communities. I think in many ways, I mean, the big thing when we started, what are the advantages for managers? They were saying, it's really kind of personally liberating that we can stay at home, we can spend a bit more time with our children. And as Alan has said, I think what we will see eventually is kind of an emergence of some sort of hybrid model with some office work, which gives the possibility of sort of learning and developing people, and maybe home working and third spaces. But a final conclusion is that one of the curious things is that a bit like unlike Alan's study, I found that managers were all saying they're working much harder, which is quite negative. But what is more positive is that their work-life balance has improved because they're spending more time at work. Clearly, our experience of work for everybody has changed, and I think it's probably changed most for Wilson, who's now herding his sheep by screen. Thank you very much indeed.
So thanks so much, Jonathan and Alan. We've had a good few questions come in. Oh, there's a sudden rush as well. Let's go to one from Claire Haven-Tang from Cardiff Met. Thanks for joining us this morning, Claire. Yeah, some very interesting points. What about the psychological impact of not actually being able to close the office door and switch off from work, especially in roles where boundaries are often blurred, e.g. academia, where there is the fine balance between work and personal research? What have your findings shown, and what can we do about that issue?
Well, can I answer that? I mean, it's a very good point, which I didn't have time to talk about. But from work that I did before the pandemic, I must emphasize that, before the pandemic, that's a real issue in that switching off, as Jonathan's talked about, the inability to switch off. I've got kind of quantitative data to suggest that that's a real issue. And those working at home have difficulties doing that. They think about the working day longer than their office-bound counterparts, because office-bound counterparts have a buffer. Commuting acts as that buffer between work and home. People miss that, actually. They miss that kind of a time to switch off, to kind of change roles, rather than just walking out the kind of bedroom, or so the blurred boundaries is a real issue. The other issue is, and also Jonathan did talk about this, is overwork, working longer hours. That is not increased productivity. And that's why in my presentation, I emphasized the point per hour. Mm-hmm. That's what we were asking people to answer, per hour, which is the definition of productivity. It's what you do per hour, not the fact that you might extend your working day. I think that's an issue as well for home working, extension of the working day. We'd say extensive work effort, not intensive work effort. That isn't more productive. If you're spending longer, it's not more productive because you're spending longer hours to do the same thing. So there's a real challenge there. Now, from an employer's point of view, that's not particularly an issue, or might not be an issue, because they're interested in output. And in a way, the extension of the working day, am I bothered about that? some employers might not be, what I'm saying is it's not all roses. I think my presentation is not presenting all roses. There are clearly challenges. There are clearly challenges for different groups. For example, homeschooling was a big challenge, and the productivity data suggests that homeschooling has a massive effect on productivity, even in the data I've got, in the quantitative data, i.e. kind of a dampening effect. Also domestic responsibilities, which disproportionately fall on the shoulders of women. That has a major effect on productivity. So you can see in the data that I've got the kind of nuances that Jonathan has been talking about. That's a long answer, but I think I've probably covered a few other of the questions in the chat.
Okay, great. Thanks. If you could go through those and turn off the ones that you've answered, Alan, that'd be great. So James Hall asked the question. This chimes very much with our own experiences as an organisation. Thanks very much, both. Are there noticeable differences between Wales and the rest of the UK re-home working? Also issues of digital access and inclusion. What about more remote areas and rural businesses? We have found that we've lost touch apart from email and phone with some people, which disadvantages us all. So what are your comments on that rural element and the Welsh perspective on home working?
I don't have an answer to that, I'm afraid. I didn't find any urban differences, but most of my managers, well, because they tended to work in big urban centres, they lived in big urban centres. I do think, just to follow up from Alan's point, though, that when I was sort of saying that people who were used to working from home more or less full time found it easier to adapt, and that's partly because they had a pattern, but also partly because other people weren't bothering them all hours. I wonder maybe with my positive hat on, where we might move to a more, appropriate pattern of working. So, for example, if you look at some of the sort of big European companies, they said, you can't email anybody after 6 o'clock. It's just pre-pandemic. And I kind of wonder if, if we have those sort of patterns, that we might find it a bit easier.
Yeah.
I can answer the one on Wales. I mean, if you look at Wales, there's been a big increase in home working in Wales across the whole of the UK, but it's not as great as elsewhere. And that's because we all know the jobs that we have are kind of lower paid. We certainly know that, are less amenable. Many more jobs in Wales, and this is statistics from the ONS, can't be done at home, basically. They simply can't be done at home. And many more jobs elsewhere can. So Wales has seen the surge, but not as great as certainly London and the South East, particularly banking and insurance, went up to 63% of those in banking and insurance were working at home in the pandemic. That's huge. Hence, yesterday in the Financial Times, there's calls from the mayor of the City of London to have a back to office week in the first week in April, because of concern about the City of London and the square mile being just hollowed out.
Okay, thanks. So Alison Parkin's got a point which builds on that. Evidence is beginning to show advantages for some disabled people and calls for employers to make reasonable adjustments for home working. On the other hand, particularly BAME women struggling with juggling jobs, often more than one job, working from home, increasing domestic work and uncertainty of childcare availability if children isolating. So many people just can't work from home. So do you feel that this is going to have like an impact on greater socioeconomic divides? How can we sort of address these differences in equality?
I mean, my figures show that kind of in terms of the composition of those working at home, it's not been disproportionate. It's not disproportionately affected men and women. The lived experiences, I think what Alison's talking about, is something I don't have data on. It's a short answer, but I'm sure she's right. But I don't have data on. But in certainly the headline figures, you're not seeing a huge surge in women working at home versus men, a huge surge in those with disability working at home, not those without disability. You're not seeing those kind of patterns. It doesn't mean to say those inequalities aren't there, but certainly in the headline figures, I'm not seeing in the data that I've got.
But my data does point to, I mean, you've got quantitative data, Alan, so your data isn't going to show in that. But my data, I haven't got data on disability or BAME, but it obviously massively disadvantages females, particularly females with small children. And secondly, a kind of an anecdote, I had a questionnaire, Zoomed the person, and she said, "Oh, I absolutely love working from home. But I live in London and my husband and I have to work out of our bedroom. That's our office." And you're thinking, oh, Jesus. So I'm thinking, well, your circumstances do different. So I'm sat in my big house in Cardiff at the moment and everything's fine. But, I think people could be.
So Andy Henley talks about, what impact do you think that this will have on house prices, for example? Will that change as people think, oh, actually, I don't have to live near the office?
Yes, is the answer. And it has. I mean, there's evidence, the Principality Building Society has been quite vocal on this recently. We've had a bigger surge in house prices here in Wales than elsewhere in the UK. And Principality Building Society put that down to people wanting to work at home, thinking about having more space to do so, vacating probably London of the southeast and coming to Wales. Also, I would add, there's a interesting issue in terms of places in Wales that have seen a bigger increase in house prices than other places, and I point particularly to Gwynedd, which has seen a sharpest rise in house prices. I would therefore add, from a policy point of view, that has consequences for Welsh-speaking society. Welsh-speaking is much higher in Gwynedd than elsewhere. Local populations already have difficulty getting a foot on the housing ladder, and the unintended consequences of home working might make that even more difficult.
Yeah, I agree with that. Already the trends where people didn't quite need to be in work so much, I think they will just exacerbate that. As it's Christmas, add on a more positive note, then maybe it'll level up disadvantaged communities. I don't know. But Alan's right on Gwynedd.
There's also the point I think several people have raised in chat about third spaces. Nick Clifton has mentioned third spaces. Others, A. Morris, I think, mentioned near from home, and that's a phrase now that's in the lexicon of the Welsh government. And he asked, "What is that?" I'm not sure. Is the short answer to that. Third spaces, but third spaces are those spaces that we used before the pandemic. And these third spaces, when I did work on this, I moved from working at home, studying at home, to those working on the move. And that meant they were using a variety of spaces, hotel lobbies, cafes, bars, anywhere is your workspace was the strap line from an Orange advert, again, 20 plus years ago. Make any space your office space. That's what the mobile phone allowed us to do. We are not in that situation at the moment. We're in the at-home situation. And I'm emphasizing at, not from. I'm not very keen on the term working from home, because that to me implies mobility. It implies I'm using my home as a base and going elsewhere. I don't think that's where we're at the moment. We're at the at. It's the at situation where we are fixed in our homes. It's the fixity we're talking about.
Trapped in our homes.
Trapped, you might say trapped in our homes, but it's the at, it's not the from. Now, Welsh government, I think, is talking about a from situation. Now, that might be the future, but it's not the now.
So what sort of responsibility do employers have to facilitate these kind of mutually convenient third spaces? That's a question from Paul Rock. And even to facilitate our own home offices, is there an expectation that that's an employer's responsibility, or will that form part of people's sort of job applications in the future? You need a highly functioning home office in order to apply for this role.
But also, the difference in the first lockdown and the second lockdown is just bloody cold now, isn't it? So heating bills, that's not to be sniffed at.
But it's true what you say. Before the pandemic, those who wanted to work at home would have a kind of health and safety check. They'd have chairs provided. There'd be a thorough investigation of their workspace. We moved into a situation of forced, quick, no choice. I think that was one of the other things in the chat, a no choice situation to a forced situation, a hurried, a rushed situation where I think employers are struggling to catch up. To be fair to them, I think they're struggling to catch up. And we're in emergency mode. We're not in the kind of let's plan it mode. I think going forward, you need to be in the let's plan it mode. So yes, employers have a responsibility for workspaces. So they have a health and safety duty to make sure workspaces are fit for purpose. I'm not sure they're doing that now because we're running to catch up the crisis. We're in crisis mode. But going forward, yes, they should. My short answer to you there, Sarah, would be this pandemic, I think, has shown that many people like working at home. Some people don't like it. I mean, clearly. But the evidence suggests that we're a lot more like it, a lot more allowed to do it than before. Many people were not allowed to do it or were not trusted to do it. And so it has kind of had an effect in that sense. It has kind of spread it out more than in the past.
And what's next for both of you in terms of the future direction of your research? There's a couple of questions looking at the psychological effects of working from home. Is that something that you're going to explore, either of you? With the School of Psychology, for example?
Probably not in my case, but I mean, I skirted over, but I mean, I touched on the some of the very negative psychological consequences of the isolation, but it's not just the isolation, it's the nature of work. It's permanently doing what we're doing now, permanently being on Zoom calls. So work was much more varied before. When you went next door for a chat, I think it's, does have significant longer term implications, which we need to think about that.
I think on the well-being, I mean, I've got data on the well-being. So there is some data in the COVID-19 study. The COVID-19 study is limited, and it often, typically with a kind of quantitative work, it maybe doesn't ask the questions you'd want it to ask, unfortunately. That's always a problem. But the evidence suggests that home workers did suffer an initial hit. I can trace a home working effect, which was detrimental, right? In the months of April, May, but not in June and not subsequently. So I interpret that as possibly people getting used to it. I mean, Jonathan mentioned earlier those who were used to working at home in his evidence kind of had less detrimental effects. And that's what I see in the data. So yeah, going forward, yes, I'd like to carry that on. Going forward for me would be the productivity issue, which Andy Haldane pointed out. Is this a short-term hit? How sustainable is this? I think that's a real issue because a lot of us are able to sustain it temporarily, but can we do so on a long-term basis?
Okay, well, I think that brings our session to a close. Thanks so much. Fascinating. I've been in this off room, part office, part bedroom for 9 months. And I personally, I find that when I get the opportunity to talk to somebody, I just talk at them at a million miles per hour because I'm starved of any kind of social contact. So I found it difficult. But the liberation that comes from not being stuck in traffic jams and rushing around from one building to the other is something that is actually a bit more settling. So it's been really interesting and fascinating to hear about your research. Thanks so much. I know that you've both committed to answer. We had loads of questions this morning and 133 people joined at its peak. So thanks everyone for joining. I know that you said that you'd follow up lots of those questions that we didn't get the time to ask. And we'll send around all the links. There's so much wonderful research that Jonathan and Alan have been working on and the work of their partners at the Propel Hub. So watch out for an email from us with all of those links. John Parry Jones is hanging out in his little Zoom to say hello to people. Please God, he's not there on his own, sad and lonely. We'll be popping over now, Alan and Jonathan, if anyone wants to chat and ask questions directly. And thanks so much for joining us, everyone. Take care. Have a lovely Christmas.
Thank you.
And, look after yourselves. Bye, everyone.